Deportation demonstrations. Senator Ted Cruz and Congressman Mark Veasey sound off on the protests against ICE and Governor Abbott deploying the Texas National Guard to various cities in the state. Redrawing Texas. The White House reportedly wants Texas lawmakers to go into a special session to consider new maps for the state's congressional districts. What lawmakers are telling me about this idea. And going for it, Democratic State Representative Vikki Goodwin tells us how she plans to unseat Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick next year. Good morning, I'm Jack Fink. Get your fix for Texas politics. Eye on Politics starts now. Hello and welcome to Eye on Politics, and happy Father's Day to all my fellow dads out there. We've got another jam-packed show for you, and we begin with two political headlines this past week in Texas. First, the protests against ICE we've seen not only here in Dallas, but across the state and in Los Angeles and other parts of the country. In Dallas, the protests did spark some violence, but only one person was arrested. While there were demonstrations against President Trump's deportations in other cities across Texas, none of them look like Los Angeles, where there were multiple acts of looting and violence against law enforcement officers. Governor Abbott has announced he has deployed more than 5,000 Texas National Guard soldiers and more than 2,000 Texas Department of Public Safety troopers to cities across the state, including North Texas, for planned protests against President Trump this weekend.
First of all, we want to make sure that what has happened in California does not happen in Texas. Texas is a law and order state, and we will use every tool that we can to ensure order across our state.
In response to the protests in Los Angeles, President Trump called in the National Guard, but a federal judge in California ruled the Trump administration took control of those troops illegally and that he must return control over them to the governor. An appeals court has now stayed that ruling and is reviewing the case. Sarah Jenkins has more on this dispute in this week's brief.
California Governor Gavin Newsom is challenging the deployment in court, arguing it causes harm and is illegal without proper authorization. The court filing asks for an emergency restraining order preventing the National Guard and active duty Marines from being used for, quote, law enforcement purposes on the streets of a civilian city. Military officials said the Marines are there for protection and crowd control, not law enforcement, and have received de-escalation training. Local leaders in California and the governor say the deployment escalates tensions and was done without proper coordination. Under federal law, active duty military cannot be used for domestic law enforcement purposes without the president invoking what's known as the Insurrection Act. It's a step President Trump has not taken. With the brief, I'm Sarah Jenkins.
Thank you, Sarah. The second major headline this past week came from a New York Times report that said President Trump wants Governor Abbott to call a special session so state lawmakers can approve new congressional maps for the second time in 4 years. The goal, to increase the number of Republican districts in Texas and blunt any potential gains in the House by Democrats in other parts of the country during the midterm elections next year. Most of the state's 38 congressional districts are considered safe for the Republicans and Democrats who represent them. A federal court in El Paso is now holding a trial to consider whether these districts, drawn and approved in 2021, are constitutional. We spoke about the potential redistricting and the protests against President Trump and his policies with Republican Senator Ted Cruz.
The reason he did that is because Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass, the governor and mayor, refused to enforce the law. And in fact, they side with the criminals, they side with the rioters, they side with the lawlessness. And this is the same pattern we saw back during the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots, where you saw Democrat politicians sit and do nothing and prevent law enforcement from keeping people safe, and instead support violent criminals who were firebombing police cars, who were looting stores, who were committing acts of violence, and yet the Democrats politically supported them and so wouldn't let police do their jobs. And I got to say, that is fundamentally wrong. And what President Trump said is he's going to step in and protect our communities, that if the local officials won't protect the communities, the federal government is going to.
I just wanted to ask you about Governor Abbott deploying more than 5,000 Texas National Guard and more than 2,000 Texas DPS troopers to be in place for planned protests this weekend.
Yeah, look, I think the governor is exactly right. In Texas, we are going to do whatever is necessary to prevent violence. Everyone has a First Amendment right to protest. You can speak, and you can speak peacefully, and the Constitution protects that right. Nobody has a right to engage in crimes of violence. Nobody has a right to throw rocks and other objects at police officers. Nobody has a right to light police cars on fire. Nobody has a right to loot stores.
I want to ask you about this New York Times report that came out this week that said President Trump wants Governor Abbott to call a special session so that Texas lawmakers can redraw congressional districts before next year's elections. And I'm wondering, what can you tell me about this? Have you been involved in that? And isn't this risky for Republicans, let alone Democrats?
So I've not been involved in conversations concerning this. I saw the same report you referenced in the New York Times. I'll say two things about this. Number one, it's clear the state has the authority to do this, to redistrict mid-decade. And you'll remember back 20 years ago in 2003, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Texas did this back in the early 2000s. And it was challenged in court, and I defended it in court. It ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the argument that the Democrat plaintiffs brought was that the state could not redistrict in the middle of the decade. And we won in the U.S. Supreme Court. I argued the case, and we won. And so it is unequivocal the state has the authority to do so. That's a decision for the state legislature and for the governor to make.
So let's talk about what President Trump calls the big, beautiful bill. The U.S. Senate obviously now is considering it. What changes would you like to see made?
Well, listen, we're going to get this done. We will get the one big, beautiful bill passed. My hope is the Senate will make it better. I'd like to see us cut more spending. I'll tell you one idea that I've been urging my colleagues to do, and an idea I urged the president in the Oval Office last week to do, is to end the Federal Reserve's practice of paying interest on bank reserves. For most of the history of the Fed, from 1913 until 2008, the Fed did not pay interest on reserves, and then it started paying interest on reserves fairly recently in 2008. In the last couple of years of the Biden administration, that expenditure skyrocketed, and it's spending now over $150 billion. That is your and my taxpayer money that is going straight to big banks. And so ending that practice, that one change alone would save $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's an example of the kind of cutting we can do.
The U.S. Senate's goal is to pass its version of the One Big Beautiful Bill by July 4th. We also spoke with Democratic Congressman Mark Veasey of Fort Worth about the potential redrawing of congressional districts in Texas and the controversy over the protests and violence against the president's deportation policies in Los Angeles.
What was happening within this very small radius of 1 square mile did not require the intervention of the National Guard, according to the governor and the mayor. And this is the showdown that Trump has been wanting for a long time. He knew that when he was going to do more controversial things that would, like, for instance, wreck our economy with these tariffs, that he needed to have something like immigration that he could go to for backup. And that's what this is all about.
What do you say to people who may be watching, Republicans who say, sounds like the congressman may be minimizing, some of the videos that we've seen where, there's violence, there's looting, et cetera?
Oh, I'm certainly not for any of that. I'm against that. I think that the lunatics that are out there doing that and throwing things at law enforcement vehicles, obviously they need to be arrested. They need to be prosecuted. They don't need to be pardoned like J6ers. They need to be put in jail and held accountable for their recklessness and their lawlessness. So I absolutely do not support that. I also think that, that they didn't need to call in the Guard.
I wanted to ask you about Governor Abbott deploying more than 5,000 Texas National Guard and more than 2,000 Texas DPS troopers.
I doubt that the Guard is needed. I anticipate all of the protests here in the Dallas area to be completely peaceful and for these protests to be peaceful. Abbott is probably also thinking that this foolish president that we have will call in the Guard for him and nationalize the Guard if Abbott doesn't call them in. So, not here to defend Abbott at all, but if you're Greg Abbott and you're sitting in office, you got to be thinking to yourself, man, is this clown going to call in and nationalize the Texas Guard if I don't do it?
Another headline that we've seen involving Texas this past week is a New York Times report that says President Trump wants Governor Abbott to call a special session to redraw congressional districts in Texas to make them more advantageous to Republicans before next year's elections. What have you heard about this, and what's your reaction?
What I've heard about this is basically what you just said. Even a lot of my Republican colleagues don't know much about this. I know they're supposed to meet and talk about this. I mean, if the courts don't demand a redraw, to me, it seems very communistic. And so I think that it's wrong. I think that it's absolutely nuts.
Republican State Representative Jeff Leach of Allen says he's heard the conversations about redrawing Texas's congressional districts.
I have, and read the story you read, have seen all the news that's been going around, and have been in communication with our counterparts in Washington and with the governor's office and the speaker's office and the lieutenant governor. And look, we're going to do what's right for Texas. We're going to do what's lawful. And so, look, we're going to see what happens over the next few weeks. And if the governor calls us back into special session, whether it's on redistricting or any other matter, then we'll show back up to Austin and we'll do our jobs. I will say we need to be careful and cautious when it comes to every issue, but certainly issues like this dealing with 31 million voters and making sure that their voices are adequately and fully and lawfully protected.
Governor Abbott has not commented on this issue. I'll continue my conversation with Representative Leach about a new law he helped pass to crack down on disruptive students in the classroom. Also, what he has to say about whether lawmakers should boost their pensions when Eye on Politics returns. Welcome back to Eye on Politics. Republican State Representative Jeff Leach helped pass some of the significant bills during the legislative session that just wrapped up. They include the Teachers' Bill of Rights, cracking down on disruptive students. And in the final days of the session, Leach got into a dust-up with Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick over a bill to give pay raises to state judges that would also boost pensions for lawmakers. I asked Leach about the compromise.
We are 49th out of 50 states when it comes to how much we pay the base district pay salary for a district judge. That is a major problem. And so at the end of the day, Lieutenant Governor and I in the House and the Senate under Speaker Burrows and the Lieutenant Governor were able to come together on what I think is a really, really good plan going forward to change that.
But there was real discussion, debate, and difference over whether this should be tied to lawmakers' pensions. You didn't want that, right?
That's right.
Initially. So why not? And how did this come to pass where you came to a compromise?
Well, at every point in session, but specifically at late in session, when we're dealing with conference committees and differences between the House and the Senate, no one gets everything that they want. Compromise in some cases is a bad word, but in cases like this, compromise is not a bad word. We had strong opinions, the House and the Senate, on how we should do this. We were able to get 5 conferees from the House and 5 conferees from the Senate together around a table to talk through those differences. And I'm really proud of how we were able to do so collaboratively and constructively. I don't believe that going forward, legislative pensions should be tied to judicial pay. I was glad that we finally ended that. Would I have liked it to be ended sooner? Sure, I would have. But that the other chamber felt strongly the other way.
Another bill that you authored that passed was House Bill 6 on public education. Why do you think it's a game changer when it comes to student discipline?
So House Bill 6, the Teachers' Bill of Rights, is maybe the bill that I'm most proud of this session. We accomplished a lot of really great things that I was proud to have a hand in, but that it was very important to the Speaker and to the House, frankly to the Governor as well, that we crack down on student discipline in our schools. Teachers have told us 2 things. They tell us a lot, but the 2 things that we heard loud and clear coming into this session was, number one, we want to be paid more, and teachers deserve to be paid more. But number two, teachers also want control over their classrooms again. They want to be able to invest in those 25 kids in their classrooms, to focus on them, to spend time on them, to educate them without one or two kids taking their attention away and distracting them by these severe discipline disruptions. Classroom clearers is what they call them. And so what we did is we restored teachers' rights and to control their classroom. Yes, to protect our kids' rights to be in the classroom, but when it comes to student discipline, to make sure our teachers have the tools and the resources they need at all levels to crack down on it. And I'm really proud of what we did. It's I think, historic and landmark.
As you know, the Attorney General is challenging Senator Cornyn in that primary. Are you going to be making any endorsements in that race?
Not yet. Not yet. But what I will say is I think the people of Texas deserve for them to be on the same stage in a debate, whether it's Senator Cornyn, Attorney General Paxton, or someone else that might enter the race. The people of Texas deserve not for them to be hidden in the shadows and largely unavailable to the voters, but on a stage, out doing town hall meetings, meeting with constituents, answering the tough questions. And I hope the people of Texas will take stock of who's willing and eager to do that and who's not.
You've been very critical of the Attorney General before.
Well, we've had our differences in the past. I will say that the Attorney General has done really good work when it comes to defending our constitutional rights, of course, pushing back on the Biden administration, now working hand in hand with the Trump administration. So personal differences aside and past differences aside, I'm interested in making sure that the people of Texas have their rights protected.
Up next, why Democratic State Representative Vikki Goodwin of Austin is taking on Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick next year, when Eye on Politics returns. We are halfway through 2025, and just around the corner are the next major elections in 2026. Democratic State Representative Vikki Goodwin of Austin announced she's running for lieutenant governor against Dan Patrick, who is seeking a fourth term. And we asked her how she can beat him.
I think the time is right. We need a change. I disagree with Dan Patrick on so many of the policies that he has, but also on the corruption that we see of him taking millions of dollars before he was the head judge in an impeachment trial. The way that he rules the Senate with an iron fist really doesn't encourage any debate over there, and members basically fear him. And so, we've had 30 years of Republican leadership. I think that many people would argue it's time for a change.
What are your main platforms? What would you like to see done that is not being done?
Well, I've always run because I'm passionate about our public education. This session we saw $1 billion going to private schools, and I anticipate with the current leadership that will continue to grow over the years. I'm not in favor of sending our public tax dollars to unaccountable private schools. That's number one. Housing affordability. I would say that all of our leaders have talked about that as being a big issue, but what we saw come out of session, in my opinion, doesn't do enough to address that issue. Water and energy, infrastructure is a big deal, and again, water was prioritized this session. We talked about a lot of things, new water, leaky pipes, but not really a whole lot about conservation. And then healthcare. I think there's a lot that we need to do around healthcare. Whether it's women having the ability to make their own personal private healthcare decisions, or whether it is in rural areas, people just having access to good primary care.
How do you really beat somebody like Dan Patrick? Because, as you know, no Democrat has beat a Republican statewide in over 3 decades.
I think it's all about relationships, building relationships with people around things that they care about. I've spent the last year traveling the state and looking at the issues all around the state. I'm not interested in the divisive issues. Let's put those aside and let's solve the problems that really make a difference in your life.
And I'm hearing you say that, and still costs money to go across the state.
Right.
It still costs money to get your message out. Texas is a big state, got a lot of expensive TV markets like the one we're in, like the one you're from.
Right.
And so how do you really do that? It's easier said than done, right?
Yeah, the first time I ran, I was not in politics at all prior to running in 2018, and I had a political consultant tell me you need to raise $400,000, and I was like, wow, that sounds like a lot of money. I did, and I won. Second time around, I had a target on my back because I had won the one Republican seat in Travis County, and they wanted it back. That time I had to spend $1 million on my campaign. I was able to raise $1 million in a state house district in 2020. So they say this will be a multi-million-dollar race, and I'm in it to raise the money and to get my message out.
Other Democrats considering running for statewide office include former Congressman Colin Allred and Beto O'Rourke, State Senator Nathan Johnson of Dallas, and State Representative James Tallarico of Austin may also run for higher office. And remember, you can watch all our full interviews from today's show on our CBS Texas YouTube page. Once you're there, hit the subscribe button. And that's all for a busy Eye on Politics today. I'm Jack Fink. I am listening, and we are listening to you on CBS News Texas. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next week. And from all of us here, have a great Father's Day and a nice weekend.